Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Leading in a Crisis with actionable business and HR strategies for navigating crisis and change. And we're going to get started right away. I'm excited to have Paul Moxness with us. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Anissa. How are you today?
Doing really great. I'm so glad you're here. Paul is the managing partner of North Point International. And our talk today is Crisis Management Lessons from the Field, a roadmap for the future. And he has a lot to cover today. So I'm going to say quickly thank you to our sponsors and get us rolling. Thank you to the Whitmarsh Consulting Group, a group of super talented multi-channel marketing experts. If you have a need for some marketing expertise, some outsourced marketing services for your team, reach out to David. He and his team do an excellent job. I also want to say thank you to Insperity. Insperity is HR that makes a difference. When I asked Insperity if they would sponsor our webinar and our virtual summit, even before I even knew how long we were going to do this or what we were going to do, they said, absolutely, we're in. How can we serve? And then I went back and I said, well, would you mind putting together something free for our attendees? And they said, how about a free HR financial analysis report and debrief? And when I asked a few more questions, what I found out was this is kind of a big deal. What we know is that HR budgets in 2020 have been put in the waste bin because everything has changed for us, right? And it may change into 2021 and beyond. And so this allows our clients and our peers and our participants to have an opportunity to take their HR budget and juxtapose it against what other organizations of similar shapes and sizes are doing in order to maximize their budget, as well as gain some real clarity around ways for improvement. They know that not everyone that takes advantage of this offer is a good fit for them. So it's not just about, organizations that are a good fit. It's about HR being of service. So don't hesitate to check that out. You can learn more about that at turnkeycoachingsolutions.net/HR report. And our final sponsor that I want to mention is our internal team of strategic planning and management consultant strategists. They have taken our data-driven strategic planning process and turned it upside down specific to our crisis of the moment. And they have created a methodology for assessing an organization, helping them create some clarity and predictability, redesigning the action plan, and then facilitating alignment to enable organizations to pivot from where you are to where you need to be. So if that is something that you're looking into, give me a call at 281-469-4244. I'd love to support that conversation. And once again, even if we're not a good fit, perhaps we can point you in the right direction. So my name is Anissa Avon, and I'm the CEO of TurnKey Coaching and Development Solutions. We are an enterprise learning and development provider and the sponsor of this Leading in a Crisis Summit. We have 40 plus speakers right now. Originally, we thought we were going to go with 40. Now we have 50 every every Wednesday and Thursday in April and May. And now we have a few more happening in June. So come back often, check out our new speakers, let us know how we can implement or find new talks that would be of interest to you. So I'm super excited to introduce you to Paul Moxness, managing partner of North Point International. Paul is the former VP in corporate safety and security. And he had me in stitches a few minutes before we started our talk because I said, well, how did you get into hospitality? And he said, well, it's kind of a funny story because he ended up working 31 years for a company that didn't want to hire him in the first place. So in a second, I'm going to have him tell you that story. But here's what's really relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Paul worked in over 60 countries in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia. He oversaw development of corporate and operational training programs, including crisis management, travel safety, challenging environment, pre-deployments, and general manager and has a general manager certification. But this is it. When he shared with me the goals of our conversation today. His experience with crisis management is relevant and timely, including dealing with terrorist attacks and other pandemics around the world. And so I'm very honored to have Paul with us. Paul, share with us what we're going to learn, a little bit about you, and take us on this journey around managing this crisis.
Well, thanks, Anissa, and thank you so much to you and your sponsors for inviting me to take part today. So you started by saying that I had kind of a different background and start in the company I work for. I was basically a university dropout. I left without completing my master's thesis in psychology. And I wanted to work in travel. So I wasn't going to be a psychologist anyway, and I always wanted to work in travel. But by the time I got myself out of university, I was 27 years old. I had no background in travel at all, and people kind of thought I had maybe the wrong background. But I finally got an interview at a hotel that needed a security guard. And I went for the interview. The security manager looked at me, looked at my resume. He said, you know, you're too old and too educated. I was getting kind of desperate by this time, so I tried to defend myself and tell him what a great employee I would be. And he just looked at me and said, you have way too many opinions. So I didn't actually leave the interview with a great feeling. But a couple of weeks later, he phoned me up and he said, I'll be honest, I didn't really want to hire you, but there was only 2 applicants for the job. And the other guy has withdrawn his application. And so they were stuck with me. And so I took the hint and I stuck with them for 31 years, rising slowly from the basement in that single hotel to ending up as the global vice president for safety and security with, I think when I left, we had about 1,300 hotels operating under one of our brands.
Fantastic.
So that's kind of how I got my start. Hotels are like little societies, and anything that can go on outside in society can also go on in a hotel. And so over the years, I've been called on to lead through what some people might say is far too many crises. I just like to think that's because I'm old and had a long career rather than that we were incompetent and just kind of went from one crisis to another. But it is a fact that crises happen. And they've happened to me and they've happened to everyone that's listening in. And I can give you a couple of examples to start off. Day one of an annual business meeting for our leaders in Asia Pacific a few years ago was just like every other annual general meeting. There were speeches, PowerPoints, recognitions, and awards. But at breakfast time on day 2, an earthquake struck the region, and it was in the Philippines. So there was no more speeches and PowerPoints. And day 2 was all about rescue and repatriation of all the people that were there. The day after Christmas in 2004, a tsunami struck wide parts of Asia. We had no hotels at the time in the impacted region, but our chief financial officer called me and said he knew that some people from the company were on vacation in Thailand, India, or Indonesia. It was the Christmas New Year's period. And we spent days trying to track people down, but there was one family we couldn't contact, and they had all died. In November 2005, we were just sitting down to dinner with an old friend of my family that my wife had never met. The phone rang. Terrorists had attacked 3 hotels in Amman, Jordan. One of those was our hotel. And then November 2015, the attacks in Paris didn't physically impact our hotels or the regional office that oversaw France and North Africa, but they traumatized one of the world's great cities. A week later, exactly a week later, terrorists attacked our hotel in Bamako, Mali, killing 20 people. Brussels, where I lived and where our headquarters was, got thrust into a lockdown at the same time due to threats. So in the space of a week, we were dealing with a dreadful attack on 2 traumatized cities and a direct attack on one of our hotels as well. And, you know, we're in the midst of a global pandemic now, and amongst other things, I was also in my corporate role during SARS, H1N1, and Ebola. And during the Ebola crisis, we had a general manager who was given two alternatives, and he was in West Africa. His two alternatives were close the newly opened hotel that he was in charge of and leave the country, or fire 50% of the staff. And he chose a third option, and I'll get back to that in a bit. And then,
I gotta say, Paul, I know you're going to keep this list going, but that is some list of pandemics and natural disasters and terrorists and loss of life and okay, wow. So you have a little of experience in enabling your team and leading through a crisis.
Exactly. And then, of course, there was a time a foreign army invaded and took over one of our hotels, leading to our first country evacuation of staff, but that was back in 1990. So wow. Yeah, crises happen all the time. Everyone's different, and everyone's an opportunity to learn.
Wow. Wow. So, the title of this is A Roadmap for the Future, Lessons from the Field. And that's exactly this. It was important for you to share all that with us, but it's almost unbelievable. I've never met someone that has had the experience that you're talking about before.
Yeah, I think we all have experience with crisis for sure, and we all will at some point. So, and the key thing is to learn from every crisis.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm going to try to go through today, is a few of how these experiences have helped me learn a lot about, what works, what doesn't work. And I'm going to end up with, we're going to go through about 7 different things that hopefully people can take away and apply to their own situations.
Great. Thank you.
So I thought I'd start, though, with a story. And I wonder how many people that are listening in saw the film The Martian. And I only saw it because my wife likes Brad Pitt. I was kind of afraid it was going to be one of those one man against the elements movies, overcoming all odds and all enemies by himself. But instead, I found it to be a really great lesson in crisis management. And so if you don't want to listen to me, just, rent the movie. It's a great lesson. And there's 2 quotes from the movie that I really like. The first one is, at some point, everything's going to go south on you. Everything's going to go south, and you're going to say, this is it. This is how I end. Now, you can either accept that, or you can get to work. That's all it is. You just begin, you do the math, you solve one problem, and you solve the next one, and then the next. And if you solve enough problems, you get to go home. Now, I think today, many businesses are experiencing exactly that feeling. Do they just accept that this is it, this is how we end? Or do they accept the challenge and start solving problems? And then the second quote from the movie, I think, is equally as impactful, and that is, every human being has a basic instinct to help each other out. If a hiker gets lost in the mountains, people will coordinate a search. If a train crashes, people will line up to give blood. If an earthquake levels a city, people all over the world will send emergency supplies. This is so fundamentally human that it's found in every culture without exception. Yes, there are bleeps, there's another word in the movie, but I'll use the word bleeps, who just don't care, but they're massively outnumbered by the people who do. And I think that's why everyone's tuned into this webinar. Anissa, you and TurnKey set this up because you wanted to help out. The sponsors pitched in because they wanted to help out. I offered to speak because I want to help out. And my guess is that most people are tuning in because they want to learn things that can help them help out. So I'm going to focus on these 7 different things that I think might help you better understand crises and better prepare to deal with the next phases, either of the current crisis, as well as better prepare for the next one, because we always know there's going to be a next one. People often say, I hope we never have to go through anything like this again. And, hope's a horrible tactic when it comes to tactics. So I'll try to give you some other things. Hope's great, but it's not the only thing you should have.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with adapting. And simply put, that means you have to accept what you can't control and influence what you can. So like today, we all wish the virus never happened. We wish it was treatable. We wish it was curable. We wish there was a vaccine that could prevent us from infection. We also wish there was more testing. We wish for a lot of things we can't control. And most of all, we wish it was all over. Yeah. But we can't control that either. So when I was in university, and I do have a degree in psychology, but just not a master's degree, but we were taught about the 5 stages of grief, and acceptance is one of those stages. Once we've accepted that a crisis is real, we can also adapt. Instead of resisting the measures we don't like and can't influence, we can adapt our behavior by concentrating on the things we can control. That's why in a short period of time, so many people have become so good at physical distancing, staying home, washing their hands, sanitizing, having happy hours on Zoom instead of at the local bar. Humans are expert at adapting to change. It can take time to accept the things you can't control, but once we do, we're actually really good at adapting. The second thing I wanted to talk about is managing. And someone once asked me to explain in the simplest possible way, how does crisis management work? And I said, it's actually just continually asking yourself a few simple questions, interrupted by brief periods of hectic, often independent activity. So when a crisis hits, most often you'll have really limited information. So the first question is, what do we know? And a crisis is separated from an incident because when it hits, there is no known set procedure you can apply to resolve it. Like for the pandemic, there is no known cure. So we got to figure that out. So the second question is, what are we going to do? And then the third question is, who's going to do what? Successfully resolving crisis is dependent on the best qualified people doing the best they can with their expertise to support overall progress. Everyone knows their role and their responsibility. Everyone stays in their lane. There's also a fourth question you can ask, and that is, what's likely to happen next? How can we position ourselves? Some people use the analogy of a crisis being like a 100-meter sprint, although this one's going to last a little bit longer than that. But if you're not prepared, you'll still be in the changing room, getting ready to go when the start gun goes off. But if you are prepared, at least you're on the start line. But unlike the Olympics, the start gun is fired by the crisis, so it always gets a head start. And crisis management tries to get you closer, tries to get you equal, and tries to allow you to overtake the crisis so you can beat it to the finish line. So crisis management at its heart is about making decisions. In crisis management, you never have all the information you need or even that you're used to getting. Crisis managers have to make decisions in a gray zone. Making no decision is normally worse than making a wrong decision. But as long as decisions aren't reckless and that they're made on justifiable grounds with the best possible information from the best possible expertise, you'll be in good shape. And then over time, more information will become available. The decisions on what next steps to take become clear, and they'll take you further toward your solution. So you're basically just asking these few simple questions over and over until the situation is resolved. It's like they said in the film The Martian, you solve one problem at a time and then you move on to the next one. But being able to gather a competent team swiftly so the process can start without delay cannot be done on the fly. You have to plan in advance. That's essential to your chances of success. So the third thing I want to touch on is organizing. To set up the best plan with the best people, it's best to give some thought to what types of crises may impact you, what resources you would need to deal with them, and where you can get the best resources to assist you either internally or externally. Remember that often the best resources may not be easily found just by looking at your organizational chart. Your board or executive committee is unlikely to be your best crisis management team. In many hotels, for example, the crisis operations director was a role better filled often by a line manager or a supervisor than the general manager. People in the front lines deal with incidents multiple times a day. Their road to accepting that stuff has hit the fan and adapting their behavior accordingly is shorter than for someone who spends the day dealing with more complex, abstract, and strategic issues from behind a desk. The role of the board and executive committees should be more strategic, finding the best team, allocating the right resources, following up to ensure the team is trained and properly prepared. So when a crisis hits, they need to step back and support the crisis management team, ensure that allocation of extra resources is approved, and ensure that unaffected parts of the business are kept informed and can keep operating as far as that's appropriate and possible.
I have a question for you on that.
Yeah.
We've met, and I happen to know a few executive teams that come from the place of command and control, kind of, we're the team that gets things done. And what you're saying is that they're typically not the right crisis management team. They're more strategic. Do you have some, what I really want to know is if you have some examples or stories of when you've seen that happen, where the crisis the people managing the crisis aren't the right ones managing the crisis, and what happens in that?
Yeah, so what happens is that you go off on a tangent probably in the wrong way. We did have a crisis, I can give a really good example. We had, I won't mention the specific case because I don't want to identify any people, but we did have a crisis where, because so many people, and that this will also often happen in an organization, people are always traveling. So you don't have the right people at headquarters all the time. Parts of your team might be out. Yeah. And so in this case, pretty much everyone was traveling in a way. And so I was in the US, and when I had to fly back to Brussels where our headquarters was. And when I got there, because so many of the people that should have been in the crisis management team had been traveling, and as you said, these top leaders they're doers, right? And so the CEO had brought in the people he thought he needed at the time, and it wasn't exactly the people that we had there. It wasn't the people we trained. They had given some responsibility to some external companies that we had agreements with for support, but they thought these companies would deal with the crisis for us, and that doesn't actually work. They're there to support you, not to run your crisis. And so we spent probably 24 hours reorganizing and getting things up to speed. So, and loss of time is your worst enemy in a crisis. What happened was, when we did a debrief afterwards and kind of went through things with the CEO and said, this is why you're not the crisis leader. Actually, what happened was, a few months later, we had our annual general meeting, and something happened in a different city where we had a pretty big, in Brussels, where we had our headquarters. It was when we had the Brussels bombings. And it was right when we gathered all the owners, all the general managers, all the corporate leadership, not in Brussels, but somewhere else. But we still had, a headquarters. We had 5 hotels in Brussels. And the CEO stepped back, said, you guys are the crisis team. Luckily, we were all there at that time. Help us run this and keep me posted. And so he was able to continue running the annual general meeting, keeping everybody at the annual general meeting updated, while the crisis team ran the crisis, dispatched people back to Brussels to support the hotels and give us firsthand information into the crisis room. And so our experience in that case was so much better. And it also allowed us to better manage the rest of the business, which was really important for us.
Yeah. Yeah, we have another question, and you may get to this in a moment, so let us know. Mohammed says, what are your best success in managing the crisis?
Yeah, so I think if we could come back to that afterwards, because then we'll be able to package it a
Perfect.
little bit better with the other. There's just four more things I want to get through first, but then we'll come back and talk a little bit about how all these things fit together.
Oh, I have one more question, and then you can tell us when you're going to answer this as well.
Sure.
And Joe says he has to leave a little early, but he wonders what kind of advice Paul gives to leaders to promote taking small steps in crisis management before bigger steps can be taken. How do the best leaders practice the little things?
Not surprising that would come from Joe, the master of flow, and the only Olympic gold medalist that thinks start lines are more important than finish lines. But, no, thanks for that, Joe. So two things. I'll get to that in just a sec, actually. But so hopefully before Joe has to leave. But the second thing I want to say to anybody that gets tired of hearing my voice and wants to take this in smaller bites or can't stick around for the whole hour, anybody that contacts me, I'll be happy to give a copy of the notes. I'm not reciting everything from exact memory. I've written things down beforehand. So I'll be happy to share those notes with you afterwards.
Perfect. And I'm going to put your contact details in the chat box so everyone has them.
Perfect. Thank you. So moving on, and this is where Joe's question comes in, actually, is training. So once you've built your organization and you're getting ready to develop your plan, training is essential. And one thing I'll say with training is that the more personalized it can become. So even before you get to crisis in hotels, one of the things we did was move the training out of a meeting room and into the workplace for people. So if we were training, room attendants on safety and security in their workplace, fire safety, whatever it was, we could do that in a guest room or in the area that they cleaned or in the kitchen for kitchen staff or, in the offices for office staff. Because then you're actually talking about something that deals with, that's to do with them. It's not theoretical. It's more like, what are the hazards in your workplace? How do you deal with them? And then step by step, once the training is over, you can even ask them to leave the training in their workplace by following the marked emergency exits and maybe completing a little questionnaire. Can they see all the signs? Can they open all the doors? Can they find the meeting point outside the hotel? But you do two things. You make it completely relevant to their workspace. It's super simple, and it's they're not having to take theory and bring it into their workplace. And how would I apply that in my workspace? So, and those are some of the really small steps you start with before you deal with crisis. You have to have all the safe working habits. They have to be completely integrated into the individual, into the individual jobs, and specifically for those. And that's actually easier. It sounds complicated to tailor training to every single job, but it actually makes everything easier on the day. And crisis management kind of builds on all of that stuff. There's a quote that's attributed to Eisenhower that he said, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything." Mm-hmm. And that's actually never truer than in a crisis, because you can have all your plans and procedures and people can evacuate, and that's a plan and procedure that works. But in a crisis, plans don't always work. If you have a crisis management plan with detailed descriptions of how things should play out, those will probably fail most miserably when a crisis hits, for the simple reason that crises never follow the plans. We've seen that quite clearly in the current crisis, where the statement, "We don't determine the timing of the next phases, the virus determines the timing." That's been used by a lot of experts and leaders. Companies, governments, and others have said things like 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and perhaps they put measures in place to last a specific amount of time. But unfortunately, there's no guarantee that the virus will accept those deadlines. And so what happens when you plan to close for 2 weeks, but you had to stay closed for 3 months? What happens when you stockpiled resources to get you through to May 1st, but you don't know how or where you can restock on May 2nd? So training for crisis is more about everyone learning what their role and responsibilities are. It's about testing communications and equipment and external contracts that you have available to support your organization. It's not about seeing if the plan is an accurate way to solve a specific crisis. So once people know their roles, how to activate and use their resources, that's where training and exercises have to be realistic but challenging. So you start by defining the role, teaching them how to communicate, how to activate, all those little things, back to Joe's small steps. But then you build that out. And once you have a well-trained team, then you can make your exercises more realistic and challenging. Sometimes even your team might complain that an exercise is over the top or too far-fetched. That's when you have to reassure them that reality in a crisis will be worse. If I had planned an exercise that depicted a hotel getting attacked by terrorists, reporting to their regional office on a different continent, but finding that the regional office was in a state of trauma following a different attack, plus an ongoing reorganization, so then escalating that to the corporate office, only to have the country where the headquarters was located to be thrust into lockdown as terrorists from the attack in the country where the traumatized regional office was, were tracked back to the city where headquarters was, people may think that was far-fetched. Throw in the fact that the head of security was traveling on a third continent and 2 other key support resources were on a fourth, and people would be certain that the scenario was the result of too much imagination.
Yeah.
The scenario, however, is something that really happened. Reality always exceeds our dreams, or in this case, our nightmares. And that's why training is so super important. And again, starting with the small stuff, what are the roles, what are the responsibilities, what are the tools, how do we use them, how do we activate, how does everyone's little part fit, and then you start building on that to make it fit together when you have a real crisis.
So you're setting us up to remember that rehearsals matter. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Rehearsing it, planning it, preparing for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what you also have to remember is that the crisis will never be like the rehearsal. So it's not like learning your lines.
Yeah.
And when you get there, you just do that and everything will be fine. And that's where after the crisis, you'll always learn something. And you'll always find out that something in the plan didn't actually work. That's where we come into the next phase, which is kind of debrief and the debrief and learning phase. So as mentioned, the crisis doesn't follow the plan. After the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, about 150 company representatives from 8 governments, experts from educational institutions, we all gathered in Washington, D.C. to review what had worked and, most importantly, what didn't work in everyone's crisis and evacuation plans. A lot of companies and governments had evacuated people from different countries during that spring. And everyone's plan had failed in one way or another. No one had a perfect plan. And actually one of the key learnings to come out of the 3 days we had in DC was avoid the perfect plan. A lot of plans after that got updated, revised, rewritten, and undoubtedly improved after that conference. Actually, the State Department produced a white paper on it that's really helpful. We used it a lot to tailor our own crisis management plans after that. And again, anybody wants to link to that, I can provide that later. Taking the time and effort to do a comprehensive, honest review and making changes that can help you next time in a crisis hits is invaluable. And even better is having a trusted network that can help you evaluate your plan, your response, and your communication from a different, less biased angle, because we'll always be biased to our own plans. And so you have to kind of remember that you can't blame the crisis for not following the plan, or for all the mistakes that you made, or the things that you hadn't thought of when you made the plan. You have to learn every time and try to improve every time. And just understand that next time you're gonna learn new stuff it's gonna cause you to make new changes. So in the current crisis, I think there'll be a lot of companies, organizations, and governments that perhaps will regret that they took things too lightly to begin with. They'll regret not taking first steps at the first signs because they thought the virus wouldn't spread too far from its original epicenter. They'll regret publishing reports or giving guidance that stated or indicated that the virus would have a limited impact on their business. And some regrets are okay, but you have to accept what you've learned and adjust your plans to make sure you don't make the same mistakes during the next crisis. Now, what I want to move on to now is empathy. And this is super, super important in a crisis. And we have to understand that every crisis will impact people. In the best case, people will be frightened and fearful. Worst case, people die or lose loved ones. And we're all people. And in a crisis, people have to be the first priority. They always have to be the first priority. And in the introduction, I mentioned the general manager in the Ebola crisis who was given two alternatives, but chose a third. His two choices were, one, close the hotel and leave the country, or two, terminate 50% of the staff to save cost. His choice, though, was to negotiate a pay cut for all staff to keep everyone employed. He was thinking of people. He didn't want to fire people, make them unemployed in a poor country ravaged by Ebola, where their chances of getting a new job were less than their chances of contracting a deadly disease. The staff, and importantly, because it's always a team effort, the owners and the brand operator agreed on a way to do that. When the international community finally woke up and started sending medical experts in larger numbers to help out, and remember, it's human nature to want to help, the hotel was fully staffed with a trained and healthy team. It became a safe haven, so the general manager's decision to put people first paid off for everyone. And crises like the current pandemic can drag on for long periods of time. Ebola was the same, and for me, so was the conflict in the eastern Ukraine. We had a hotel managed by one of our brands in Donetsk, eastern Ukraine, and when the unrest started to grow, the east was more or less cut off from the rest of the country. We expected the hotel to close, but business was surprisingly good because the international observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe had moved in to monitor the situation. And so, as we always did when we had hotels in difficult situations, my deputy and I called on an almost daily basis. The crisis dragged on for months, I think probably 14 months or something.
Oh my.
But at one point I asked the general manager if he saw any value in our calls, because I couldn't change the situation on the ground for him. I couldn't promise help if something happened. We couldn't get there. And so I said, do you have any, are you tired of me calling you all the time? Is there any point to this? And he said, you're our lifeline. He said, you remind us that there's hope. You remind us that there's normalcy in the world. And he said, my team here performs to our brand standard better than any team I ever had, because this is the only normal thing they have in their lives right now. He said, your calls are important to me, and it lets me tell them that the company cares. He even invited other team members to listen in on some of the calls, and some of them hardly even spoke English, but they listened just for the satisfaction of knowing that someone cared. And I think, that morale and things like that is super important. And the only way to get that is to really show genuine caring. And so in the current situation, it's also going to drag on. And life as we knew it, it's not going to return. So whatever you do, don't forget that the people that are impacted by the decisions, don't forget the people that are impacted by the decisions you make. I was once approached at an annual leadership conference by a general manager from a hotel in a country that had been through a really rough year. And we'd had regular calls throughout the year with him as well. He sought me out and he said he wanted to shake my hand because we'd never met in person. And this was back in the days when we still shook hands with people. But he said, apart from me, only 2 other people from headquarters had called him during that year. One call was from finance asking why his numbers were so far off his budgeted projection. And his answer was that the country had experienced a coup and that travel had therefore not been at expected levels. The second call he had from the global headquarters was from someone in HR asking why his scores on staff satisfaction were lower than the previous year. And so again, he had to explain that the country had a military coup, and since staff salaries were tied to revenue, many people were earning less and thus less satisfied in general with their jobs. His point was that no one had called just to ask how he was doing. He felt no one really cared about anything except the numbers that he sent in. And so whatever you're faced with during this time or any time of crisis, please remember the people, because that's what's going to make the difference at the end. And that brings me actually to the last point I wanted to cover, which is reaching out. And during my many years as head of global safety and security at a major international hotel group, I was, for the most part, the only person on the corporate payroll, at least in security. I had a deputy, but he was officially employed by a hotel, and we reimbursed his hotel for the hours he spent supporting me. In the final few years, we had explosive growth, and 3 people were actually on the corporate budget in addition to myself. But in any case, and in many businesses, people with specific subject matter expertise are either alone or part of a very small team. And in the corporate world, you can find yourself with almost as much internal competition for budget allocation as there is external competition for market share. And then when a crisis hits, suddenly everyone looks at you as a leader in your field and they're asking, what are we going to do now? When will this be over? When can we get back to normal? And a good thing to remember, especially in a crisis like now that affects everyone, is that although you might be the only person in your department or your company in your role, you're not alone. You have colleagues in other companies that are in the same situation, feeling the same sort of feelings. And in the early 2000s, there were quite a few terrorist attacks on hotels in different parts of the world. And we discovered then that going it alone was not a good solution. If a hotel from a specific brand was attacked in one location, the global company that owned that brand would manage and survive, but all the hotels at the destination would suffer as business dried up. So we informally started to engage with counterparts from other hotel groups. And in 2007, some of us founded what's called the OSAC Hotel Security Working Group. And OSAC stands for the Overseas Security Advisory Council. It's part of the US Department of State Bureau of Diplomatic Security. After the attacks in Mumbai in 2008, we reacted like most humans would. We wanted to help out. So we banded together, pooled our resources, traveled to India, and held workshops for hotel security directors from any of our hotel groups or other hotel companies as well. And people came from all over India and even the broader South Asian region. It was so successful that we held similar workshops every year after that in different locations around the world. And during the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, we had daily calls with our counterparts to share information and support each other. And then when terrorists attacked a hotel in the group I worked for in 2015, my colleagues in the working group were of unbelievable support to me and the company I worked for just by being on the other end of a phone when I called to ask for guidance and advice. They knew me, they knew my role, and they knew it could have been them in my shoes. They understood what I was dealing with and they wanted to help. So 3 of the managing partners at North Point International were from that same small group that started the Hotel Security Working Group. And knowing the value of having a trusted group of people that understand your role and your responsibilities in your company was why we started North Point. We wanted to be there for people that otherwise may not know where to turn to look for support, both in the good times when you're fighting for budget and the bad times when you're in the midst of a crisis. So that's kind of the 7 things I wanted to run through, and I can just quickly recap them by saying, crisis is going to happen sooner or later. You never know what, you never know exactly when, you never know exactly where, but they're going to happen. And the clock is already ticking on the time you have to start preparing for the next one. To start organizing, start planning, start training, start exercising. When crises happen, most people will want to help and accept that you're facing a crisis with an unknown outcome. Activate the plan, but accept that the crisis won't follow it. The knowledge, experience, and flexibility you have, and flexibility that you develop during the planning and training will serve you well as you accept reality and adapt to manage your response. And then when the crisis is over or after any incident, take time to review it. Update your plans with your new knowledge and practice the new protocols so your team is prepared for next time. Remember, it's not the crisis' fault if the plan fails, so don't hope reality will behave better next time round. And then just before we move on to an open discussion, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, I'd just like to close with a little anecdote on crisis management that I'm currently experiencing as I shelter in place up here in Canada. Dr. Bonnie Henry is the public health officer in the province of British Columbia where I live. She has become somewhat of a celebrity by the way the crisis has been managed here, where the curve is flatter than in most parts of Canada, and where restrictions are even slightly less intrusive than in other provinces. But what has impressed me most when I watch her daily briefings is how she's maintained her focus on the big picture, and importantly on the impact her orders and regulations have on people's health, people's safety, and people's general well-being. The result of her empathy and her focus on people has been that most people have accepted the situation and they've wanted to contribute to successfully manage the crisis. A number of businesses that haven't been ordered to close have closed to play their part. Guidelines on social distancing, staying at home, traveling only when necessary have largely been followed. And I live in a province where people don't always follow guidelines from the government, put it that way. But some people say that crisis management is mostly about communication. I disagree. I think if you don't properly respond and manage a crisis, communication is not going to make everything look good. Communication looks good when you've managed the crisis properly and focus on what's most important. And what's most important is the impact your response will have on people. And so Dr. Henry concludes all of her daily updates with the words, we have to remember it's not forever, but it is for now. And now is the time to be calm, be kind, and stay safe.
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of wrapping the whole thing up, is that it's crisis management is all about people. And so, yes, we have technology, plans, procedures, all that, but everything we do has to be done with people in focus.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, really good points. Folks, if you're with us and you have questions, we'll monitor the chat box and let us know. But I actually do have a few questions. One is related to, what we're seeing confirms what you've just said related to communication is not enough. But even in the organizations who are being empathetic and proactively communicating, we're seeing some glitches, messages not being received, employees not feeling supported or feeling safe or coming back to work when they're requested. What do you do when your crisis plan, when the virus doesn't respond to your plan, as you mentioned, because it's not going to? So what do you do to adapt from there?
So I think it's super important to be honest and realistic. So you have to be truthful, transparent, communicate clearly what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, all this kind of stuff. But you also have to accept that people are people, and not everybody is going to get the message at the same time, and they're not all going to interpret it the same way. You have to continually evaluate, are we doing the right thing? How is this going to impact everyone, not only the people that work for you, but your suppliers, your customers? What is the impact, and what can we do with that? And I think we have to remember that it's not, there isn't a completely right answer right now, because we don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know, if it's going to really start spreading badly again. We don't know if they're going to find a vaccine. So it's not about being altruistic and just being a nice guy. It's about thinking things through and then making tough, hard decisions, evaluating, is there anything else we can or should be doing as more information becomes clear? But I think it's, we can't force people to follow the rules. We can't force people to do to interpret things the way we interpret them. I do think that in a lot of cases, our perception of what's happening, or the perception of how the public is perceiving things and behaving even, is different from reality. When we had, beginning of April, when Easter came around, and Easter is a long weekend in Canada, and it's a big travel weekend. And the government guidelines were only travel if necessary. Don't go to your cottage, don't go on vacation. And the media and anecdotes on social media were about the ferries to Vancouver Island were packed with people. Nobody was following government guidance. We were going to have this massive spike. And then about 4 or 5 days after Easter, the ferry companies came out with their statistics that showed there'd been a 92% drop-off in traffic from last year to this year. So all the anecdotes, all the stuff you see, it's not always reality. And that's, again, why it's really important to have really good sources of information and talk to people, find out what's really going on, and don't base your reactions on what you see on Facebook or even what you see on the news, because everyone has their biases. You have to look at a broad picture. For me, having a network of colleagues at other companies and discussing with them, aligning with them, because we're not competing on this. We're trying out, everyone has to try to survive. And the better we could do that, the better responses we got in our own companies as well.
Yeah. Good advice. Facts. I'm going to read you 3 questions. They're different, but I want to prepare you, because we want to speed through these. Some really, really good. Peter says, except for your own experience, where do you draw your knowledge from, Paul? Are there any books, websites, blogs that you can recommend? And then I want to read Manisha's questions. Have you ever dealt with internal dissent during a crisis? And, of course, your advice on that. And then, of course, what are the attributes of an effective training plan for a crisis? And there's a few others, but I wanted to get those out to you. So let's start with Peter's. Where do you draw your knowledge from? Books, websites, blogs, resources?
Yeah, so there's tons of stuff out there, that's for sure. We live in an information age. So my best sources of knowledge have been, I always try to go to the source of expertise. So in this current crisis, I think going to the CDC, going to your local health authorities, looking at that, remember, those are also people. So they're not trying to scam us, they're not trying to trick us. They're the people that have spent their whole life studying these subjects, and they're trying to tell us what's best. We have to try to figure out how we apply that, but that's probably the most accurate sources of information. So when we were going out at North Point, we published a newsletter every 3 weeks and blogs and stuff. But when we were first looking at this, I always, because I was in a global company, I would always check what I was seeing with my local experts, with experts in the countries that we were looking at. So at North Point, with this one, we looked at the CDC from Singapore, we looked at the CDC from Korea, and I looked at the CDC from our province here in Canada to see what are the adaptations. And there's very little dissent between the experts. There's different ways of saying things and different ways of administrating different orders that they give to their citizens that are often more culturally based, but the basic expertise is the same. So I always try to go to the expert source. And then I have my friends and colleagues that have the same kind of jobs and responsibilities that I have. And have had, and those were my benchmark people. Because again, this isn't stuff we're competing on. We're not trying to, when we were in the hotels, it wasn't about, we wanted our hotel to be safe and the other hotels to be unsafe. We wanted everyone to be safe because, as I mentioned, if you have an incident at a destination, the destination suffers as much or more than the brand.
Wow. Yeah. Well, what about the internal dissent during a crisis? And we've had multiple questions about this. Someone else wrote something similar. What if the people that are being led by leaders that do not have the best interests of the whole? So the focus of the people or internal dissent.
Yeah, and those things can come. I remember, if you had, so one thing I always said when I did crisis management, I'd love for everybody to agree on everything and I'll be friendly and stuff like that. And we have a lot of democracy in the way that we run businesses today, especially in the Western world, Western Europe and North America, where we try to, let everybody have their say and things like that. But I always said that, when it's a crisis, you don't really have room for democracy, because you're trying to make decisions as quickly as you can with the information you can. So you have to try to you've set up your crisis management team with the best experts that you have access to. Listen to them. And, afterwards, there isn't room for dissent. So you just kind of have to overrule and move on. And afterwards, that's when all the dissent, there's more room for that, right? Bring that out, discuss everything, be willing to change everything. It's also one of the things I'm really, really impressed by here in our province is that, number one, the premier of the province, who's a guy kind of the same as a governor in a US state, he's basically just backed off and pushed his health officer and the minister of health. They're the people that are running the crisis. And the guy, his popularity rate has gone from 8% before the crisis to 56%. So it's amazing what can happen when the right guy shuts up, right? He gets more popular. Yes. But it's been super successful. And even the other political parties are supporting the provincial government efforts. One of the key leaders of town hall meetings they've been having is the health expert from the opposition party. But he's running it on behalf of the government because they felt he was best qualified to do it. So you use the best experts. You don't allow, if people run off on tangents, let them run, because you have to move the right way, and the leader has to lead. And by that, I mean, it might mean stepping back and giving the reins to an expert. But I think getting defensive and trying to have a big, long discussion about why we're going to do this or how we should do that, you just don't have time. You have to trust. And that's why when I said we have these questions, what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? Then they run off and do it. And then they come back. Everybody has to stay in their lane. It's not like, well, why did you do that? And why did you do that?
Not enough time for that.
Because that's their job.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we agreed, and that's what was done. Now we know this. We ask the same questions. What are we going to do now? Who's going to do it? When are we going to meet back here? Okay, out and back, and away you go.
Well, I think that leads us right into, and just so folks know, if you do have to drop off on the call, Paul, I'm good. If you can hang out a little bit longer and we can answer a few more, you got to, okay. And we will have the replay up, usually the same day. So come back if you have to pop off and want to listen to Paul's answers to the rest of our questions, then hang out with us or come back later and listen to the replay. But what you just said leads us right into Manisha's other question, which is about the attributes of an effective training plan of a crisis. And, what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? And what was the other question? What are our roles?
Yeah, divide up the roles and responsibilities. Then when you're in the crisis, and if you're doing a simulation, same thing. And it's, what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? What do we know? What are we going to do? Who's going to do it? What do we think is going to happen next? Those were like the 4 questions. I think super important is for the training is that you do get to the point where it is realistic. People will say, but it's just the training exercise. I always remind them that, when Roger Federer was on center court at Wimbledon, it's not like he didn't practice. And every time he practiced, he knew it wasn't the real thing, but he practiced as if he was at Wimbledon, right? And so you have to have the same thing. And, people will giggle and laugh and all that, but if you have a well-designed exercise, by the time it's over, all the giggling and laughing about, trying to simulate around a tabletop, it goes away. Once people start dying in the scenarios or what they thought was going to happen doesn't happen, and they're faced with 10 times as big of a problem, the giggling and laughing goes away, and people do become really involved. And that's what really helps them later on when they're in the real situation. It's like they've almost been there before.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's another question from Chris. Do you believe that this current situation will make organizations look at how they deal and organize their risk and crisis management strategies?
I think every crisis that happens, you have to do that. You have to do that. I don't necessarily think the time is right for that now. We're still in the midst of it. We still need to be doing the right thing, dealing with it as best we can, learning as much as we can now, and adapting to that and managing that. But yes, later on, and I guarantee you here in our province, once it's over, the opposition party is going to jump up and down and say, why didn't we stockpile better before? Why did we make these cutbacks or those cutbacks before? Why weren't we better prepared? All those discussions will come, but now's not the time for it. Yeah. And I think that's the main thing is like, yes, always review and try to be honest, even have external people review what you did. And advise maybe on how you can do it better next time, but don't do that when you're still dealing with the crisis.
In the middle of it. So I have 2 more questions. So I'm gonna rattle those off. One is actually from me about and analyzing the economic impact, the financial impact, and the crisis strategy of creating a resilient plan for out of the crisis. I want to get your take on a model and a practice and an approach for businesses in that regard. And then the other question says, hi, Paul, and my chat box. Hi, Paul, how beneficial would you say becoming qualified as a general manager was? And did this help shape your approach towards supporting the wider company differently than, say, from a security and safety perspective?
Okay, I'll start with that last question first, because just to clarify, I'm not a qualified general manager. What we did was we created what we called the General Manager Certification Program. And it was kind of an introduction for new general managers to how our company operated. It introduced them to all the key people at headquarters. About 20% of it was safety and security and crisis related. And so I designed that program, but I took part in the whole certification program because we were each other's students as we designed it. But so I'm not like officially a certified, qualified general manager, but what I will say is that the more you know about every part of your business, the better you will be in your role as safety, security, or crisis leader. We need to, everything we do has to be relevant to the business. And the better we can understand that, the better we'll become. And that's why I said, you know, moving the training from the meeting room into the workspace was super helpful, because two things, it helped us uncover a lot more risk in those workspaces that we didn't know about it because the employees told us. And so we understood that better, they understood us better. To the second question about the economic impact and building a resilient plan, I think the economic crisis is going to be a byproduct of the current. Right now we're in a health crisis. It's going to drive an economic crisis, which potentially can drive a lot of other crises in our society. We've seen already unemployment rates are skyrocketing pretty much everywhere. We're going to have to deal with those kind of things for quite some time. They will impact us in a lot of other ways. So one thing we've been talking about at North Point now is preparing businesses for all the other things that are going to impact them. You know, now they can start production up again, they can start operations again, they can start getting some revenue flowing, but a lot of them have slashed so many resources from just to cut costs, just so they can survive. There needs to be an impact analysis, a business impact analysis about what knowledge have we lost, you know, and what risks does that bring to our company? And if you're not looking at the broad picture, I think, and you're just focusing on economic survival, or just focusing on making your workplace safe or something like that, you'll miss out on these other things, and the impact will be much greater than otherwise. And I think, again, if we look at how things are being managed here in our province, they've had that view the whole time. So even though it's the health officer and the health minister that are leading the way, their focus has been safety, health, safety, and well-being. And well-being includes the economic well-being. So we've actually had less restrictions on businesses than most other parts of Canada. So we haven't shut down all the businesses. We haven't shut down construction sites. They focused on how to keep those operating by maximizing physical distancing and all these things, but don't shut production down, because that will hopefully soften the blow on the economic side later. So I'd say on the resiliency thing, you have to look at a really broad picture and keep that in mind, even though you're dealing with a very specific type of crisis right now.
Yeah. Wow.
That's another reason why the crisis team has to be different than the executive committee and the board. They have to have the big, broad view and not only focus on the crisis at hand.
Response. Mm-hmm. Wow, very good. I want to make sure that folks know how to get a hold of you and why they might reach you. I want to read a fan of yours. Michael wrote, "Crisis management prevention, ! Is something which is very often back of mind in many organizations, kept in a manual on an office shelf that is taken down and dusted off in case something did happen. Paul was extremely successful in keeping the mindsets within the hotels front of mind and part of the day-to-day routines of the hotel's teams, and thereby preparing and readying the teams proactively for the inevitable crisis." And your expertise today is absolutely demonstrated, your experience and what you're bringing forth. Tell folks, how do we get a hold of you, and for what reasons might we reach out to you?
So you can reach out to me for any reason. I try to be as approachable as possible, but yeah. So my email at North Point is P Moxness, in one word, kind of. at northpointinternational.com, Northpoint International in one word, or go on our website or find me on LinkedIn and reach out. But yeah, my background is maybe a little bit special, but I try to be a people person, and thank you, Michael, for that shout out. I'm not paying you for it, so anyways. And Michael's off on an adventure of his own with his family, and I'm glad to see that he's tuned in, and I hope everyone's well. No, it's, my expertise has kind of been, how do you take complex things, try to make them simple so that they can be practical and have the results that you hope to have when they're applied in the real world situation. So we didn't write big, long, huge manuals because we knew those would end up on the shelf. We tried to create practical tools of support, and that's also what we try to do at Northpoint is develop tools of support. And right now for COVID-19, we've put up a portal on the Northpoint website with we're putting more and more resources and tools in there that people can download for free, because we just really don't think that this is the time to start selling stuff to people. Yeah. And we have our expertise, we have our experiences, so we're sharing with that. We're sharing that freely with people now.
And that's so that they can go to your website and download that guide. Folks, you have Paul's email. And Paul, I just want to say thank you for sharing your knowledge and just honestly the humbleness that you present, and the humility, the willingness to share freely, and your expertise. So it's very timely, and we appreciate you very much. I'm going to real quickly just check in on our chat, because I see some folks are saying thank you so much. This has been great. And let's see, where did it go? Thank you, Paul. Thank you. You guys are welcome. This has been very different than a lot of the talks that we've had. So thank you. And I hope people will reach out to you, because you have a lot to offer.
Well, thank you, Anissa. And as I say, everyone's welcome, and we're all people. We can all learn from each other. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Paul, you and everyone on the call, stay safe and healthy.
You too. Thank you, Anissa.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.